Nancy stood before the iron gates. Her knuckles were white, the skin pulled tight against the bone as she gripped the cold metal. The driveway stretched out ahead, a vast expanse of gray gravel leading toward a mansion that seemed to scrape the clouds. She took a breath, but the air felt thin and heavy. Behind her, the iron gates groaned. The sound vibrated through the soles of her boots. With a sharp, metallic clang, the latch locked. She was inside. She did not look back. She turned toward the house, her gaze tracing the height of the stone walls until her neck ached. Servants moved in the distance, their steps rhythmic and precise on the stone paths. They glanced at her, then looked away, their movements stiff. Nancy walked forward. The gravel crunched under her feet, a loud, solitary sound in the stillness of the grounds. She reached the base of the marble steps and stopped. The mansion loomed, its windows dark and reflective. She placed a hand on the cold stone of the porch. The silence of the mansion brought back the noise of Springfield. It was not a sound, but a pattern of movement she knew by heart. She remembered the way the neighbors would stop their conversations the moment she turned the corner. They would look at the ground, then pivot sharply, crossing the street to keep the width of the road between them and her shadow. They whispered behind cupped hands, their eyes darting toward her parents' house, as if the very air around the structure were tainted. They called it a curse. She remembered the way the grocer would slide her change across the counter without touching her fingers, his face tight with a practiced nervous speed. Every door she approached in that town had been closed before she could knock. The memory pressed against her temples, a dull, rhythmic ache. She stood on the marble porch, the cold stone biting into her palms, and realized the distance she had traveled was not just miles, but a total severance. The mansion was quiet, but the ghosts of those averted gazes followed her into the foyer. The foyer was cavernous, smelling of floor wax and stagnant air. Nancy stood still, her breath hitching as she waited for the house to demand something of her. A floorboard creaked in the distance. She turned, her muscles coiled, expecting the judgment she had known in Springfield. Instead, an old man emerged from the shadows of a side hallway. His face was a map of deep, weathered lines, yet his eyes remained sharp and clear. He did not look at her with the familiar darting suspicion she had come to expect. He walked toward her, his pace measured, his weight balanced. He stopped a few feet away and held out a hand, palm open. His presence filled the space, pushing back the cold draft from the high ceilings. He gestured toward the inner rooms with a slow, deliberate motion. "You are safe here, child," he said. His voice was low, devoid of the tremors or sharp edges she was used to. He waited for her to respond, his gaze steady and patient. Nancy looked at his hand, then back to his face, the tension in her shoulders beginning to ebb. For the first time in months, the air in the room did not feel like an accusation. She took a tentative step forward, following him away from the heavy entrance. The old man led her deeper into the house, his footsteps echoing against the high, vaulted ceiling. Nancy kept her eyes focused on the floor, watching the way her own shadow stretched and distorted across the polished marble. She felt a shift in the air, a drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the draft from the windows. She stopped. Behind the old man, tucked into the deep, impenetrable shade of the foyer, a figure stood motionless. It was the son. He did not move to greet them. He did not offer a nod. He simply stood with his arms locked tightly across his chest, his brow pulled into a sharp, rigid line. His eyes were fixed on her. They did not scan her face. They traveled downward, lingering with deliberate coldness on her dusty shoes and the calloused, rough palms of her hands. Nancy stood frozen, the heat of his scrutiny burning against her skin, while the old man continued to walk, unaware. The hallway stretched forward, a tunnel of dark, polished mahogany that seemed to swallow the light. Nancy walked slowly, the soles of her shoes clicking sharply against the floorboards, a sound that felt too loud in the oppressive quiet. She reached out to steady herself against a wall, but the wood was cold and unnervingly smooth, and she pulled her hand back as if burned. Every room she passed was a cavern of heavy velvet curtains and towering furniture that dwarfed her. She felt like a ghost haunting a space that had no room for her. She stopped in the center of a grand gallery, looking up at the ceiling that vanished into shadow. There were no windows here, only mirrors that reflected her own small, still figure against the vastness of the estate. She turned a corner, expecting a door, but found only another long, silent corridor. The house was a labyrinth designed to keep people out. The scale of the mansion was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, reminding her that she was an outsider in a world of judging shadows. The silence of the upper hallways became unbearable, a vacuum that pulled at her nerves. Nancy turned away from the grand gallery, her feet moving with purpose as she sought a different rhythm. She followed the faint metallic clatter of pans and the distant, low hum of human voices. The air changed. It grew warmer, thick with the scent of roasting herbs and damp stone. She pushed through a heavy, swinging door and stepped into the heart of the service wing. Here, the polished mahogany vanished, replaced by sturdy wooden tables and the constant, rhythmic scrape of knives against boards. No one looked at her with the cold judgment of the foyer. The cooks moved with a frantic, necessary energy, their focus entirely on the heat of the hearths and the preparation of the evening meal. Nancy stood in the doorway for a moment, letting the noise wash over her. It was a language she understood. She walked to a basin, the water splashing against the ceramic, and felt the tension in her shoulders finally begin to ebb. She reached for a stack of heavy, unpolished pans, her fingers finding a familiar grip on the metal. The labyrinth of the mansion fell away, replaced by the simple, grounding reality of work. Nancy plunged her hands into the basin, the water scalding and thick with soap. She pulled a heavy copper pot from the pile, its surface blackened by fire and neglect. She grabbed a handful of coarse sand and began to scrub. The grit bit into the metal, a harsh, rhythmic rasping. She worked with a steady, relentless pressure, her knuckles turning red under the heat. A cook dropped another charred pan into her basin, a silent challenge. Nancy did not look up. The metal groaned under her friction, then gave way, revealing a streak of brilliant, polished orange. Around her, the kitchen staff slowed their own tasks. A sous chef paused, watching the way she cleared the grime. The head cook walked past, his gaze lingering. He nudged a stack of dirty plates toward her, with a nod of silent approval. The kitchen door creaked, and the frantic pace of the staff died instantly. The son stepped into the room, his boots clicking sharply against the stone floor. He did not look at the cooks or the steam rising from the pots. His gaze moved across the room like a blade, searching for something out of place. Nancy sat on a low stool near the hearth, her back to the wall. She held a torn apron, the fabric frayed and thin. She pulled a needle through the seam, her movements slow and deliberate. The son stopped 10 feet away. He did not speak. He watched the way her fingers navigated the tear, the way she pulled the thread taut to ensure the stitch would hold. The silence in the kitchen stretched, heavy and suffocating. The son stood motionless, his arms crossed tightly against his chest. Then, without a word, he turned on his heel. The heavy silence left by the son lingered, but the work demanded attention. Pots clattered, and the fire roared in the hearth. Nancy stood and moved to the basin, her hands still stained from the morning's labor. Near the pantry, a young maid stumbled, her grip failing on a stack of ceramic plates. The porcelain rattled, a sharp, jarring sound against the stone. She leaned against the wall, her face pale, her breathing shallow and ragged. The other staff members kept their heads down. Nancy did not hesitate. She set her rag aside, crossed the floor, and reached for a clean glass. She filled it from the copper pitcher, the water cool and clear. She moved to the maid, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. The kitchen seemed to shrink around them, the cold grandeur of the estate fading. Nancy stayed until the girl's breathing evened out. She did not ask for thanks. She simply took the empty glass, nodded, and returned to the basin. The staff watched from the corners of their eyes. The rhythm of the kitchen shifted in the days that followed. It was not a sudden change, but a slow, steady erosion of the tension that had once defined the space. When Nancy scrubbed the copper pots, she no longer worked in isolation. A cook would move closer, offering a dry cloth to help polish the metal. When the heavy sacks of flour arrived, the younger staff did not wait for an order. They moved to assist, their movements mirroring the quiet, deliberate pace Nancy set. She asked for nothing. She did not seek praise from the head cook or recognition from the stewards. She simply arrived before dawn, tended to the fires, and kept her head down. The air in the service wing, once sharp with the fear of reprimand, grew thick with a strange, calm purpose. Even the clatter of dishes became less aggressive, the porcelain handled with a new, careful precision. Nancy moved through the labyrinthine halls of the mansion with the same steady grace, her presence acting like a dampener. She spent hours organizing the pantry shelves, labeling jars with a steady hand, and ensuring the linens were folded with exact corners. The servants began to linger in her company, finding that her lack of ambition was a reprieve from the constant, grinding pressure of the estate. The son stood in the threshold of the pantry, his back pressed against the doorframe. He watched Nancy for an hour. She was polishing a silver tray, her movements rhythmic and devoid of hesitation. He waited for her to glance toward the master study to seek an audience, or to pause and complain about the labor. She did not. She simply turned the tray, wiped the surface, and set it aside. He shifted his weight, his boots clicking sharply against the stone floor, yet she did not look up. He searched for the angle, the hidden motive, the play for favor that he expected from everyone. He watched her mend a torn curtain, her fingers moving with precision, never once checking to see if he was still observing. The silence between them grew heavy, a physical barrier he could not breach. He stepped into the room, his shadow stretching across the floor to touch her feet. She merely moved to the side to give him space, her expression neutral, her focus returning immediately to the task. He frowned, his jaw tightening. He looked for the cracks in her resolve, but he found only the steady, quiet work. He turned and walked away, his pace uneven. The shift in the household was palpable. When the son retreated from the pantry, his frustration was visible in the stiff set of his shoulders. The staff, who had spent months watching from the periphery, began to change their posture. A senior maid, who had previously kept her eyes fixed on the floor, stepped forward to clear the space where Nancy was working. She caught the eye of a footman, offering a sharp, knowing nod that signaled a silent pact. They began to move around Nancy not as overseers, but as a protective perimeter. When the son returned to the hallway, his presence no longer triggered the usual frantic scurrying. Instead, the staff slowed their pace, positioning themselves to block his direct path to the kitchen. They exchanged glances that were no longer fearful, but steady and observant. They watched him with a collective, quiet defiance. If he approached, they would suddenly find a task that required them to stand between him and the work table. They mirrored Nancy's calm, treating her with a deference that had nothing to do with rank. The staff had chosen their side, and the atmosphere was beginning to thaw. From the balcony overlooking the grand hall, the old man watched the scene unfold. He saw the staff move with a new, deliberate cohesion, their bodies forming a silent, impenetrable screen around the girl. He did not intervene. He did not demand an explanation for the sudden shift in the house's rhythm. Instead, he leaned against the mahogany railing, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood. A faint, secret glimmer of pride sparked in his eyes. He had watched her for weeks, noting the way she never faltered, never sought praise, and never let the weight of the mansion's cold history pull her down. He caught Nancy's eye for a fleeting second as she carried a tray toward the dining room. She offered a brief, respectful nod, and he returned it with a slow, knowing smile. He knew the history of the engine she had repaired in the rain. He knew the cost of the reputation she had left behind in Springfield. The son paced below, still blind to the quiet revolution taking place, but the old man turned away, his gait lighter than it had been in years. The kitchen was quiet, save for the rhythmic scrape of a knife against a wooden board. Nancy's hands moved with practiced, steady force. They were not the hands of a guest, nor the hands of a servant who merely went through the motions. They were mapped with the history of her survival. A deep, hardened callus sat at the base of her thumb, a permanent souvenir from the engine work in Springfield. Her palms were rough, the skin thickened and scarred. She reached for a heavy copper pot, her fingers locking around the handle with a grip that spoke of iron-willed endurance. The son entered the kitchen, his footsteps sharp and deliberate on the tile. He stopped abruptly. He expected to see the frantic, nervous energy of someone hiding a secret. Instead, he saw the raw, physical reality of her labor. He watched her hands, the way the tendons tightened, the way the skin resisted the heat of the stove. He looked at his own hands, soft and idle by comparison, and then back to hers. The criticism he had prepared died in his throat. He did not speak. He simply stood in the doorway, his gaze fixed on the calloused, capable hands that were slowly dismantling his entire perception of her. The air inside the mansion grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and damp earth. Outside, the sky bruised into a deep, sickly violet, pressing against the tall windows. A sudden sharp gust rattled the glass panes, the sound echoing through the halls like a warning. Nancy paused at the kitchen counter, her hands stilling as she felt the drop in pressure. The wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound. In the corridor, the son stopped his pacing. He looked toward the ceiling, his brow knitting together as the house groaned. The light in the foyer flickered, casting long, erratic shadows that danced against the walls. He walked to the window and placed his palm against the cold glass. The trees outside whipped in a frantic, chaotic rhythm, their branches clawing at the stone facade. It was no longer just a shift in the weather. The wind shrieked, a high-pitched wail that demanded attention, and he turned his gaze back toward the kitchen, his expression tight with a new, restless energy. The storm had arrived, and with it, the sanctuary he had built began to tremble. The old man did not raise his voice, yet his command cut through the howling wind with absolute authority. He stood at the threshold of the grand hallway, his hand raised to beckon the staff. Everyone moved to the library, he said. Nancy wiped her palms on her apron and stepped away from the counter, her movements fluid and calm. The son watched her from the shadows, his jaw set in a hard, unyielding line. He remained rooted to the spot for a heartbeat, his eyes darting between his father and the girl. The mansion groaned as a massive branch struck the exterior wall. He finally followed the procession. The library door stood open, revealing rows of dark, towering shelves. The old man walked to the center. The son leaned against the heavy oak doorframe, his eyes never leaving Nancy as she took her place near the back. The gale slammed into the library walls with a force that made the heavy mahogany shelves shudder. Outside, the wind shrieked like a trapped animal, a relentless, high-pitched wail that tore through the night. Rain lashed against the tall, arched windows, blurring the world into a chaotic smear of gray and black. Each gust hit the stone masonry with a dull, rhythmic thud, causing the very floorboards to vibrate beneath their feet. The old man stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the center of the room, while the son gripped the back of a leather chair, his knuckles turning pale as the house groaned under the pressure. A sudden, violent crack of thunder shook the rafters, and the library lights dimmed, casting the room into a flickering, unstable gloom. Nancy stood still, her gaze tracing the movement of the curtains as they billowed inward from the force of the draft. The son looked toward the glass, his brow furrowed, his previous coldness replaced by a sharp, involuntary alertness. He braced his weight against the floor, his body reacting to the house as if it were a ship caught in a rising tide. The storm was no longer a distant threat, it was inside the room. The old man stepped away from the center of the room, his movements precise despite the house trembling around them. He walked toward a small, recessed alcove lined with velvet. He reached into the shadows and pulled out a heavy, silver-framed photograph. The metal caught the dim light as he turned, his face set with a grim, quiet resolve. He did not look at the storm. He looked only at his son. With a steady hand, he held the frame aloft, forcing the room to focus on the image trapped behind the glass. It showed a car, rusted and abandoned, half buried in the mud of a roadside ditch. The engine bay was open, wires exposed, a testament to a failure that had once stranded them in the middle of nowhere. The son stared at the image, his initial defiance faltering. He stepped closer, his boots clicking sharply against the polished floor. The photograph was the anchor, a physical piece of history. The old man held it firmly, his knuckles steady, waiting for the son to connect the memory. The silence in the library deepened. The father's voice cut through the library, steady and resonant, refusing to be drowned out by the dying gusts of the storm. He did not look at the photograph anymore. He looked directly at his son, his eyes hard with a long-held conviction. "You see a poor girl," he said, his words echoing against the high, dark bookshelves. He gestured toward the back of the room, his hand trembling slightly with the weight of his intent. "I see the hands that fixed my engine." The son stiffened, his head snapping toward Nancy. He had spent months dismissing her, treating her as a fixture of the kitchen. Now, he was forced to look at her, not as a servant, but as the person who had saved his father from the freezing rain. The father took a step forward, the frame still clutched in his grip. "While the world abandoned me, she was the one who worked until her fingers were raw." The silence that followed was absolute. The son stood frozen, his mouth parted, the arrogance visibly crumbling under the gravity of the truth. The son's gaze shifted from his father to the woman standing by the library door. He searched her face, looking for the girl he had ignored for weeks, and found instead the memory of that night. The freezing rain, the biting wind, the absolute isolation of the road, it all flooded back. He remembered the sound of metal clanging against metal, the persistent, rhythmic scraping of someone working beneath the chassis in the mud. He had been miles away, safe in the city, while his father had been stranded. He realized now that the person who had crawled out from under that engine, soaked and shivering, was the same person he had treated as an invisible servant. His breathing hitched. He looked at her hands, really looked at them, noting the calluses and the faint, permanent stains of grease that no amount of scrubbing had fully erased. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had been looking for a reason to dismiss her, yet she had been the only one to offer a lifeline when it mattered most. The arrogance that had anchored his posture for months dissolved, leaving him standing in the center of the room, stripped of his certainty, forced to confront the depth of his own blindness. Nancy did not move. She remained anchored by the heavy oak door, her head bowed just enough to keep her eyes fixed on the floorboards. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, knuckles pale against the skin, yet she held them steady. She did not seek to defend herself, nor did she look up to claim any credit for the past. She simply existed in the space, a quiet, immovable presence amidst the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. The kitchen staff stood in a small cluster near the hearth, their faces softened, eyes darting between the son and the woman they had watched work for months. One of the cooks shifted her weight, the floorboards creaking under the pressure, but no one spoke. The silence was thick. Nancy's breathing remained slow and rhythmic, a stark contrast to the ragged, uneven gasps coming from the sun. She did not flinch when the fire popped. She stood as she always had, patient, observant, and entirely unburdened by the need for validation. Her humility became the focal point. The sun pivoted. His movement was sharp, cutting through the heavy air of the library like a blade. He turned his head, his eyes locking onto Nancy, with an intensity that made the surrounding staff hold their breath. For weeks, his gaze had been a cold, measuring tool, designed to find flaws and confirm his own superiority. Now, that gaze faltered. The tight, calculating line of his brow began to soften, the skin around his eyes relaxing as the internal wall of arrogance crumbled. He looked at her, not as a servant, not as a source of labor, but as the person who had saved his father's life in the freezing mud of Springfield. His jaw loosened. The suspicion that had defined his posture for months evaporated, replaced by an expression of dawning, genuine respect. He blinked, as if seeing her for the first time, his pupils dilating in the firelight. The silence between them stretched, no longer charged with hostility, but heavy with the weight of a hard-won truth. He took a half-step forward, his weight shifting onto his front foot, his hands dropping from his chest to his sides. The son did not look away. He shifted his focus from Nancy to the small group of kitchen staff huddled near the library's edge. He searched their faces, looking for the same skepticism he had harbored for weeks. Instead, he found only quiet, steady agreement. The head cook, a woman whose hands were permanently stained with the work of the kitchen, offered a slow, deliberate nod. Beside her, the younger maids mirrored the motion, their eyes fixed on Nancy with a mixture of warmth and unwavering loyalty. No one spoke, yet the library filled with the sound of their collective affirmation. It was a physical weight, a wall of testimony. He watched as they stepped forward, just an inch, their bodies aligning in a silent protective formation around the woman. The tension that had gripped the room for months snapped. The staff's faces, once guarded and tired, were now open and clear. The son looked back at Nancy, then returned his gaze to the staff, his own posture finally losing its rigid, defensive edge as he accepted the truth. The son began to move. His first step was deliberate, the heel of his boot striking the polished floorboards with a sharp, echoing crack that silenced the library. He did not rush, yet his momentum was absolute. Each stride was heavy, rhythmic, and purposeful, a physical manifestation of his internal shift. He walked past the rows of mahogany bookshelves, his eyes never leaving Nancy. The sound of his progress was the only thing in the room, a steady, percussive beat that seemed to hammer away the remnants of his old, rigid worldview. He reached the center of the rug and paused. For a fraction of a second, his gaze dropping to the floor as if he were physically stepping over the debris of his own past mistakes. Then, he looked up, his expression clear and devoid of the cold calculation that had marked his face for months. He took the final, decisive step, closing the gap until he stood inches away from her. The air between them, once thick with his suspicion, now felt thin and expectant. He stood tall, his shoulders squared, but the tension had drained from his frame. He had crossed the physical space and dismantled the prejudice. The son stood motionless, his gaze locked onto Nancy. He did not speak, but his hands moved with a sudden, fluid purpose. He turned toward the long, polished table and gripped the back of the heavy chair at the head of the setting. The wood groaned as he pulled it backward, the legs scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. The sound cut through the library like a blade, drawing every eye in the room. He did not stop until the chair was fully extended, clearing a path for her to sit in the place of honor. He held the back of the chair steady, his fingers pressing into the grain of the wood, waiting. The household staff stood frozen, their breath hitched in the sudden vacuum of the room. The old man watched from the shadows, his expression unreadable, while the silence stretched, heavy and absolute. Nancy remained still, her hands clasped, looking at the chair and then up at the sun. He did not blink. He held the position, his posture offering an invitation that defied every expectation of the mansion. Nancy moved forward, her steps light on the floorboards, and took the seat. As she settled into the wood, the tension that had gripped the library for months began to evaporate. The fire in the hearth flared, casting long, dancing shadows across the mahogany walls, and the heat reached out to touch the faces of everyone present. The mansion, once a cold, towering structure of stone and silence, seemed to exhale. The heavy velvet curtains no longer felt like barriers, but like soft, protective layers against the storm outside. Outside, the wind still lashed against the glass, but the sound was muffled, distant, and harmless. The household staff shifted, their shoulders dropping from their ears as they moved closer to the warmth of the fire. The old man leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on his knees, watching the flames reflect in the polished surfaces of the room. Every corner of the library, previously defined by rigid boundaries and unspoken rules, now felt grounded and accessible. The air smelled of burning oak and dry paper, a scent that replaced the sterile, metallic chill of the past. Nancy looked toward the hearth, her hands finally resting flat on the table. The space around them had ceased to be a fortress of status and had become a sanctuary of shared presence. The walls held the warmth, the light softened the sharp edges of the furniture, and for the first time, the mansion felt like a home. The son remained standing, his hands resting on the back of the chair opposite Nancy. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time without the lens of his own prejudice. The sharp, calculating line of his brow smoothed out, the tension leaving his jaw as he processed the reality of the woman sitting before him. He took a slow breath, the sound audible in the quiet library. He leaned forward, closing the distance between them until his voice was a low, steady vibration in the air. "I was wrong," he said. The words were simple, devoid of flourish, yet they landed with the weight of a physical blow to the silence. He held her gaze, refusing to look away, his eyes steady and clear. The shadows that had clung to the corners of the room seemed to recede, and the heavy, suffocating atmosphere that had followed Nancy from Springfield finally fractured. That invisible, lingering weight, the label of the curse, dissolved in the warmth of the hearth. The son pulled his hand back from the chair, his posture shifting from defensive to open. The air in the library grew still, as the last remnants of the past were swept away. Nancy did not rush to answer. She simply sat, her hands resting on the polished wood of the table, feeling the solid, unmoving weight of the mansion beneath her. The fire continued to pulse in the hearth, throwing embers into the dark chimney. But the heat no longer felt like a reprieve from a storm. It was a constant, steady warmth. She looked at her palms, the skin still marked by the calluses of months of labor, and saw them not as signs of a desperate past, but as the tools that had built this moment. The whispers from Springfield, the cold stares of neighbors, and the heavy burden of the label they had placed upon her. All of it had failed to break her. She had not needed to change her name, her history, or her nature to find this place. She had arrived here through the simple, persistent rhythm of her own work. The son remained by the table, his presence no longer a wall but a bridge. The old man watched them both, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. Nancy stood up, her movements fluid and deliberate. She walked to the window, looking out at the night. The rain had stopped. The clouds were breaking, revealing a sliver of moonlight that touched the gardens below. She was the architect of her own quiet, enduring reality. The mansion was silent, not with the coldness of a fortress, but with the peace of a home earned.